Story 1: The Missing Phone. Last night, after a few drinks, my friend dragged me to a local bar for a music night. We were enjoying the show when I realized my phone was missing. I checked the table, the bathrooms, and even the bar counter, but there was no sign of it. After a moment of panic, I asked my friend if I could borrow his phone to call mine. It rang twice before someone answered on the other end. I could hear a low, raspy giggle before they abruptly hung up. I tried calling again, but no one picked up. Frustrated, I gave up and went home, thinking my phone was probably gone for good. The next morning, I woke up, walked to my nightstand, and found my phone right there, exactly where I had left it the night before. It was as if nothing had ever happened. Story 2: The Bus Driver. When I was a kid, I was always the last one to get picked up by the bus driver. One cold morning, I stood waiting alone for the bus to come, when a strange one pulled up. The bus was empty, and the driver, a tall man with dark eyes, smiled and told me to get on. Something about the situation felt off, so I asked where the other kids were. He casually replied, "We'll go get them now, just get on." His insistence only made me more uncomfortable, so I refused. The man shrugged and drove off, but not long after, the real bus showed up. I got on and went to school like normal. It wasn't until later that night when I mentioned it to my parents that they seemed truly worried. Looking back, I now understand just how close I came to being in real danger. Story 3: The Lady Next Door. A few years ago, I rented an apartment from a friend who had bought it recently and renovated the entire place. The apartment was nice, but there was something very off about the lady next door. She was in her mid-40s, but looked much older. She spent every night listening to Christian radio shows and talking to someone, though I never saw anyone else in her apartment. Eventually, I went over to ask her to keep the noise down. When she opened the door, I was taken aback. Her walls were covered with crosses and Bible verses scribbled in different colors, the windows were painted black, and the place had an overwhelmingly damp smell. It was like stepping into another world. I asked her to lower the volume, but she just looked at me, then slammed the door in my face. The next night, I woke up to find a shadowy figure standing next to my bed. It was her, holding something in her hand. I didn't know what to think. Was I dreaming? But then she spoke, "You should lock your doors at night," and walked out. I later found out she had been breaking into other apartments too, including one where she had been found standing behind a couch, holding a power drill. I was terrified and called the police. They knew all about her, but there was nothing they could do. She owned the apartment, and unless she left, they couldn't intervene. I stayed awake for days, waiting for her to run out of cigarettes, and the moment she left for a late-night run, the cops took her away. She was a violent schizophrenic who hadn't been on her meds for a while. They took her to an institution, and I never saw her again, but I still have nightmares about that night. Story 4: The Broken Window. I was finishing my night shift in a quiet industrial area when a loud crash interrupted the stillness. Someone had thrown a rock through one of the windows of the office. It was 11:30 p.m., and the area was completely deserted. After calling security, I returned to my desk, trying to shake off the nerves. I was freaked out but eventually decided to head home. As I drove back, the unease grew, and I started overthinking things. When I arrived at my car, I realized I hadn't locked the door. My heart raced as I checked the back seat for any hidden intruders, but the car was empty. Half an hour later, I decided to join a friend who was out drinking. I hopped on my bike and began the ride over. The night was peaceful, but then I noticed someone riding behind me. They passed me slowly and gave me an unsettling smile. As they got closer, I realized something horrifying. The person was riding my mom's bike. I immediately bolted back home, only to find her bike missing and the back door of my car open. I was sure something terrible was about to happen. Story 5. The Payphone. I worked night shifts at a campground, from midnight to 8 a.m. It wasn't a bad gig. I'd passed the time playing games or reading. But one of the other night shift workers, who was leaving, warned me about the payphone outside the shack where I worked. He said it rang every night at exactly 4:17 a.m., and although he never answered it, it always rang just once. I started leaving the window open during the summer nights, and sure enough, the phone would ring at the same time every night, a strange, eerie sound. After a few weeks of hearing it, I decided to finally pick up the phone. When I did, there was only silence on the other end. I waited for a while, asking hello, but no response. A week later, I answered again. This time, I heard a rasping breath and then a voice, gravelly and rough, saying my full name, first, middle, and last. It was a voice I didn't recognize. I hung up immediately, but when I tried to call back using *69, the number was from California. I lived in Indiana, and there was no reason for anyone in California to know my name. The call stopped after that, but the strange feeling never went away. After the call from the mysterious voice, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I kept my windows closed and locked my doors with more attention than usual, but I could still feel a lingering presence, something dark and persistent. That night, I sat in the shack, staring at the payphone through the dim light, my mind racing. Every little sound seemed amplified, like the world was holding its breath. For the next few days, the phone remained quiet. I thought maybe I had imagined it all, that it had been some kind of prank or a weird coincidence. But every night at 4:17, I felt the tension in the air, as if something was waiting, something I couldn't escape. It became a ritual of dread, one that I couldn't explain. Then, one evening, just as the clock struck 4:17, the phone rang again. The same eerie, submerged tone. This time, I was more prepared, more determined to understand. I grabbed the receiver, heart pounding in my chest, and said nothing at first, just listening to the sound of my own breath echoing in the silence. There was a long pause. Then, that same raspy voice, the one I heard last time, returned. It was as if it had been waiting for me to answer. "You should stop listening," it rasped, the words slow and deliberate. "They know you're here." The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The voice wasn't just speaking to me, it was warning me. But warning me about what? Before I could say anything, the line went dead. I slammed the receiver down and stood frozen, listening to the faint buzzing from the phone as it hung off the hook. I couldn't move. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to leave, to run as fast as I could, but I didn't. I just sat there in that little shack, staring at the phone. The rest of that night was a blur. My mind wouldn't stop racing, trying to connect the dots, but there were too many unanswered questions. Who was calling me? Why had they known my name? Why the cryptic message? The next few weeks were marked by the same eerie calm. The phone never rang again, but the unease stuck with me. I started hearing strange noises at night, soft footsteps just outside the shack, or the rustle of leaves when there was no wind. But every time I looked outside, nothing was there. Finally, one night, I made up my mind to find out what was really going on. I left the shack and made my way to the payphone, convinced I needed to destroy it, to end whatever connection there was. When I reached the phone, I was ready to yank it out of its place, but something stopped me. It wasn't the phone that had been the source of my fear, it was something else. Someone was watching me from the shadows, just beyond the edge of the campground. I could feel their gaze, heavy and cold, but when I turned to face it, nothing was there. I left the phone alone, but I never felt the same afterward. The feeling that I was being watched never faded. And as I drove away from that campground for good, I glanced back once more, only to see the faint outline of someone standing at the edge of the woods. They didn't move. They just watched. I never returned to that campground again. The payphone was eventually removed, but the memory of that voice, that warning, still lingers in my mind. And every time I hear a phone ring in the distance, my stomach drops. They know you're here.